Well, hi class. This is John Kinzer. I hope you all are doing well, and I feel like you're the class in exile. I'm the teacher in exile, but that's okay. We're making the best of it, and I hope that you're able to keep up with our lectures as we continue with America's Providential History. Today, I'm going to send you the Lesson 17 and Lesson 18 a handout, and we're going to be using that as we go through our notes today. But I wanted to just recap. Part of Lesson 17 is what is a Christian form of government or a biblical form of government. And I want to kind of remind you and kind of recall that as we think of terms, we want to identify them. And so form is an external shape or arrangement of parts. And so the key thing that Webster says in his dictionary and his definition is that it's external. A form is something that is not internal, not in the heart, but it's a arrangement. It's an arrangement of parts. And of course, Christian is of or pertaining to Christ. So it has to do with Christ, how Christ lived, how he taught, simply pertaining to him. And then government is one that we for sure want to know Webster's definition for. And government is anything that does four things. It's anything that controls, that directs, that regulates, or restrains anything else. So it does four things. It controls, directs, regulates, and restrains anything else. So these are what we'd call the components of government. And notice it doesn't talk about civil government here. Its government is anything. It could be parents. It could be laws. It could be the law of gravity. Gravity is going to control. It's going to direct, isn't it? It's going to restrain you. And so we can really have a number of different forms of things that have control over others. And we can list those out, and you can probably think of, gee, my school does that. My family does that. My church does that. There's self-government. There's vocational government. Businesses control the way their employees behave. There's a lot of different things that we could use here, one of which is civil government. And our neighborhoods even exert a control. We have to behave a certain way. We're restrained when we're in a neighborhood. It's not the same as being out on a boat in the middle of the ocean. So, so these would all be forms of government. And of course, we've been focusing on one form. Well, I shouldn't say that. We've really been focusing on several forms of government. Self-government, which is the root or the basis of all the other forms. Without self-government, none of the other forms are effective. But we've also looked at family government. We've looked at church government. We've talked about the role of pastors in the American War for Independence. We've talked about civil government. What is the true basis of civil government? We've talked about, we mentioned our vocation, our jobs. We've talked about the church. We've talked about neighborhood, being governed by those that you live most closely to. And we've talked about voluntary associations, how America really is founded so that there's a need for voluntary associations, small groups of people who pick up the ball and deal with problems and don't just look to the government. So civil government was, of all of these, rather small in our founding fathers. The one that, of course, that were larger, much more predominant, were church government, the role of voluntary associations. I guess I got here church on here twice. Sorry about that. Families were so much more dedicated and solid years and years and years ago. So we have a number of just different arenas that exert government. So we have to be careful when we use that word government. We have to, as we talk to our children, as we talk to people, we want to stress that self-government is the root. It makes the others successful. So we look at types of government, and we have listed as hopefully you'll see there. You should have gotten this lesson 17 dealing with government and biblical principles of government. But we have a monarchy, and of course, monarchy is one rule. We have a king. Mono means one. Archos in the Greek means rule. So monarchy would be one person rule. A king, a queen, a dictator could be a one person rule. So one person, and we know that's a bad thing, because one person with all that power will surely abuse it, and we see that through history. So we look at a democracy, and most people in America would say we're a democracy. But we really aren't a democracy. Democracy means 50% rule. The word literally means demos is the people, ocracy or the archos, the rule. So it's rule of the people. Literally means rule of the people, and the people vote. And so we talk about it being not a 50% rule, but what? 51%. Yeah, 51% rules. We sometimes call it majority rule. Sometimes we call it the rule of the majority that tramples on the rights of the minority. It's the tyranny of the majority. And so democracy never lasted long, and among the Greeks, James Madison and others who studied it very closely knew we did not want to go in the direction of democracy. So they founded a republic, and that's really what we are. We're not a democracy. I guess you could say we are a democratic republic, in that one day a year, on election day, 51% of the people elect a representative, right? And then those representatives pass the laws. So we are in a republic, not the rule of the people. Republic would be rule of the people. We do choose our representatives. But here's the key: through elected representatives. Elected representatives. So our founding fathers knew that the true blessing of government, civil government, would not be having a king ruling over you, or not having 51% of the people who can be wrong and whose opinions sway and who can be very emotional. We see how that certainly can happen. That's not what we should be making decisions based on, but electing representatives. So hopefully the representative would be a smarter person, a wiser, someone who's older, someone who has training, someone who is not just an upstart. And so we have seen some of those types of people not very well qualified in office, and their youthful indiscretion usually brings humiliation. It brings embarrassment, and so eventually they are replaced by someone who is more seasoned, more wise, who has a gotten a bigger perspective on life through their experiences and education. Hopefully we'll even elect Christians. As John Jay said, that we should prefer the election of Christians as our officers and as our representatives. Well, we also have a few other types that we could just mention. One is socialism. Now, socialism is also defined, it's close to a democracy. It says rule of the people, and the state owns all the means of production and distribution. So production and distribution. So in this case, the people rule, they elect representatives, but the state and these representatives are now going to determine everything. They own all the means of production and distribution. So it's a state-owned economy. And that's kind of the basis of socialism. Socialism, of course, what makes it attractive is that, it looks like, the state, the civil government can be kind of a judge of treating everyone equal. And so the hallmark of socialism is a call for equality. If you remember the French Revolution, where at the Congress of the Tennis Court, where all the radicals got together and decided they were going to behead King Louis XVI, and the slogan of the revolution was liberté, égalité, and fraternité. So liberty, equality, and brotherhood. Those were the three calling cards of the French Revolution. And so in the name of equality, they beat down anyone who was unequal or tried to raise up the poor and the common people, and it didn't work. And there was great loss through the French Revolution. Lots of people killed, guillotined. In Paris alone, 30,000 people were guillotined during the Reign of Terror. And so our founding fathers were afraid of democracy. They feared socialism. And so they founded a republic, which does not guarantee equality. It says that you have equal justice under the law, that everyone is under the law, but not everyone is equal in their property, because we all have different abilities and gifts and callings. So there's going to be inequality every way you watch. So as we look now at a couple of others, aristocracy is a poor form of government, but better than democracy. And so we have an element of aristocracy in our government. What is an aristocracy? Aristos means wise, and ocracy, of course, rule of. Rule of the wise is what this means. And so usually the wise are a council of men of great ability or landholders or wealth. And of course our government, the Senate, is probably the closest thing that we have with that. Now, in a sense, the Supreme Court is also an aristocracy. They are justices who are elected, and they are elected for life. They can be impeached, and there have been, I believe, 2 Supreme Court justices removed from office for incompetency. But it's difficult to impeach, and it's not often done. but they are like an aristocracy. It's a council or a group. Now, another one which is not mentioned on your list there is oligarchy. This is another form of government that the Greeks had. And this means rule of archos, the oligs, or the few. So the few rule. And of course, that's similar to an aristocracy. Now, aristocracy usually has the idea that the people are there by inheritance. They're in families, well-established families that kind of feed good quality people into the society. So you might think of kind of the ruling class there in Virginia for the first 50 years of the Republic. You had the Lees, you had the Madisons, you had the Monroes. They even called it the Virginia Dynasty. The first 10 presidents, 5 of them were Virginians. And so there was an aristocracy, usually based on birth and your family. An oligarchy, though, is usually based on wealth, or these would be business, successful business people. So they have talked about, as an example, today in Russia, there are a number of wealthy businessmen that kind of rule the country, and they call them oligarchs in Russia. So, so a little bit of a background there. We can understand. Big idea is that America is not a democracy. No, far from it. We are a republic. We have separation of powers. We have different people in charge there that make it so there's checks and balances. And America is definitely not a democracy. Now, the Bible is pretty clear on a number of these issues about civil government. As we look at centralized government, as the state grows, we see 2 passages that really give us much information. And these are, I think, bellwether passages. These are key passages that really inform our whole philosophy about centralized government. The first one is Genesis 11, and of course that's the Tower of Babel. And here's where, of course, the men unite, and they want to make a name for themselves. They are building a tower. They're not going out and doing work that God wants them to do. They've concentrated on the plain of Shinar, and they're building this tower so that they can kind of raise their religion to heaven, and on their own strength and their own ability, rejoicing in their oneness, having one language and one purpose, God comes down and scatters them. And so we see that God's purpose is that they be scattered over the earth, not centralizing, and that they have many languages. And so we see God's great love of individuality and different cultures. He's causing it. He disperses these people. And so Genesis 11 is a key passage in understanding, I think very clearly, God is not for one world government. He's not for one government, one language, one culture. And you see how he opposes that. And that's something for us to be reminded of. That's I think in many regards to oppose with manly firmness, no, on centralizing or becoming one world or globalizing. I think it's fine, foreign trade, it's fine to visit other countries, but God has made the nations. God has set distinctions and delights in those differences, and we see that in Genesis 11. Now, second passage is 1 Samuel chapter 8, and here Israel wants a king, and They're very adamant about it. They don't want God's rule over them. It's interesting. God tells Samuel, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. And so what looks like a rejection of a king of a prophet to make a king is really a rejection of God. And so we see that going to an ecclesiastic of high rank, like a pope, or a bureaucrat of high rank, like a king, we see that relying on a person is not God's desire for man. So 1 Samuel 8, kings and dictators, high ecclesiastical authorities are always a measure of last resort. It's when things are really coming unglued that we look to establish or ensconce a king. So God is not for these high civil authorities. Even though he is a king, God is king over all the world and all the universe, he is not looking to establish little kings everywhere. So it's an interesting thing. Number 4, we talk about internal principles and external forms that are necessary for a republic. So as we think, what is necessary? What should we believe and establish for a republic? There's several internal ideas, principles in the heart and mind, and then there's several external forms which are important for establishing a government. First, internal is that if we want to establish a republic, we need to value individuality. And individuality is that God has made everything different, many, many different various and varieties of things that God has made. And he delights in that individuality. So there's nothing wrong. In fact, we should embrace differences and varieties, and we should not be saying, hey, everything needs to be the same. This is the opposite, actually, of sameness and oneness in that regard. So we really want to be establishing a individuality. Now, second principle is self-government. We need to really establish the fact that the individual self-government is really at the basis of a republic. And of course, what does that mean? It means being controlled, directed, regulated, and controlled, not by others, but by yourself, and learning to govern yourself. And as Christians, we would say, yes, under the control of God, as we walk with him and as we work with the Lord and growing in him, we allow him to govern us. And not men, but that we govern ourselves. And number 3, Christian character. So character being those things that are stamped in us, they're pressed in us through difficulties, through trials. We have things that are cut into us, that are engraved on our heart. And so character is something that really happens through difficulty. Our character is formed. And we want to have the character of Christ, that it'd be Christian character. And so Christian character of love and faith and loving kindness and generosity and showing mercy. These are all character qualities. And a culture needs those character qualities to support a republic. A republic is not going to have a king who's telling you what to do. It's not going to have a overwhelming government that owns everything and regulates everything. No, the government is going to really depend so much on the character of the people. So Christian character needs to be valued and encouraged. Number 4, we also need as an internal understanding and belief is the idea that of property, that God owns everything, and we are what? Stewards. So stewardship of property. And we've talked about this idea of property, and we know that property is really something that God gives us. He owns everything. Number 5, so therefore government, I didn't probably say one of the most important things, government does not take away or redistribute property. It what? Protects property. The role of government is the protection of private property. And that was one of the clear statements that our founding fathers talked about. So government's not supposed to dispose of our property, but to protect our property. Number 5, unity and union. That unity is internal agreement that we have. And union is the arrangement of those who have unity. So we need to realize that our internal unity is what builds a strong union, not the force of soldiers or the force of laws. It's an agreement, a sense of needing one another. That is building the agreement and unity that's needed for a strong union. One of the things we see in the ancient world is that there was, with the Greeks, a love of liberty. They all united on that. They had a unity. Each city-state had a different government, and they all had a great measure of unity, but they never were able to form a strong union. That union never came about unless they were being attacked by the Persians. And then it was a very weak union, just something that would get them by until the Persians left. And so the Greeks ultimately were swallowed up. They had bickering and fighting in the Peloponnesian Wars. Sparta decisively beat the daylights out of Athens and her allies. But everyone was so exhausted at the end of that process of fighting one another, that then Alexander the Great swept in and united all of them under his despotic rule and his desire for one world government. The Romans, on the other hand, had a very, very strong union, but they removed liberty. People were very upset with the Romans, hated the Romans, their loss of freedom and unity. So as a result, the Romans were despised. People lost their freedom under Rome. So they had a strong union, but did not have any agreement with the different nations they took over. So I would say that these are the internal factors, you could say, that are needed for a republic, the internal principles. This would be in the hearts of people, are being taught and believed by the people. So what would the external factors be for people? So as we think of external factors or external features, the form, if you can remember, the form is critical to think of. There really are 3 things that a republic has. Number 1, a republic, you must be electing representatives. So there must be representation. And representation means there has to be elections. People are choosing. That's going to strengthen self-government. People are looking at different candidates. They're all different. That's individuality. People are hopefully electing those who have Christian character, who have a sense of protecting property. And then ultimately, the people are electing, and their collective judgment is forming a unity of action for and a unity of ideas. And so they can be happy and settled with their representative. So if a person is not happy with the outcome of an election, they need to work to get their candidate elected the next time. That's how you deal with it in a republic. The way you have the government working is through representation, not overthrow, not in some other means, not by just character assassination or whatever. You've got 2 years to go, or 4 years, or 6 years, depending on the office. A second thing is separation of powers, so that different branches of government, the executive, the judicial, and the representative or legislative branch, those are separated, and they all have their own jurisdiction, and they also have checks and balances. So in a republic, you need that. If you don't, then it becomes very easy for one person to accumulate the power, and you very quickly go toward a monarchy. Thirdly, we have federalism. So federalism is that idea that there are different levels of jurisdiction in each branch. So for instance, if we were to think of things as a triangle, government as a triangle with the people at the base, well, the government level that's closest to them would be the local governments. The next would be county, the next would be state, and then, of course, the nation on top. And this is directly taken from Deuteronomy 1:13, where there's captains of tens and captains of 50s, hundreds, thousands, and Moses is at the top of the pyramid, only doing those things that the other levels can't do. So this builds efficiency. The local level of government is effectively closer to the people, knowing that local condition and serving the people, taking care of needs. And then only those things that the local can't do, the county does. And only those things that the county can't do, the state does. And so government gets smaller as you go up this pyramid, and only those things that the state can't do, the national government does. Things like treaties with foreign countries, things like executing all the laws, things like justice, providing justice on the national level. For instance, when states have an argument, the Supreme Court has to deal with friction and controversy between the states. So we need all three of these. Now, if something is removed, let's say that someone cancels the elections because of a natural disaster or something, watch out, red flag goes up. Do not cancel the elections. That is moving us away from a republic. It'll be very easy to cancel elections the next time. We all know how that goes. We've all raised kids, right? And we all know that the exception becomes the rule, doesn't it? With our children and others. So we have to be very careful about making any exceptions. Or if someone says, hey, let's just get rid of the county level and go straight to having the state of New Mexico, let's just get rid of counties. Well, that's going to be hurt, because what does this do? This idea of federalism divides power, divides responsibility, divides jurisdiction out on different levels. So watch out. Don't let anybody remove any of these three. Now, can those three exist while the internal character traits are going down? Let's say the government decides to take over all the property. There is no private property anymore. Well, that's going to be terrible. That's a foundation stone that government is supposed to protect. But could you still have elections? Yeah, you could. You could still have, in other words, the form of a government, even though these internal qualities are gone. So it's very important to think that the internal really is the critical. Internal qualities, internal agreement, internal unity are most important to maintaining a government, a republic. If you want to undo a republic, weaken any of these principles, weaken property, weaken agreement, weaken self-government, weaken individuality, weaken Christian character, remove character training from the schools, and discourage families from doing that. See, those are things that we should support. We need to reinforce with all of our hearts. We need a reinforcement of the internal qualities. That's where we start. And that's why so many Christians, of course, call on the Lord and seek revival. Basically, isn't that true of even in the church? Revival is agreeing again with those things that God has taught us, and so we renew our covenant with Him, and it's a renewal of our walk with Him. So we could talk about that a lot. That would be a great subject for discussion. Let me go on to part 2 now.